The Skeleton by Rabindranath Tagore was originally published in Bengali as Kankal in 1892. The English translation of the story is from the collection Mashi and Other Stories, published in 1918. To contextualize the narrative more effectively, let us now turn to a brief overview of Rabindranath Tagore's life and literary contributions. Tagore was a prolific writer of novels, short stories, songs, plays, and poems. He introduced new literary forms and the use of colloquial language into Bengali literature. In 1913, Tagore became the first non-European to win the Nobel Prize in Literature for his profoundly sensitive, fresh, and beautiful verse in his poetry collection, Geetanjali. He holds the unique distinction of having composed the national anthems for two countries, India's Jana Gana Mana and Bangladesh's Amar Shonar Bangla. He was a vocal critic of rigid, conventional schooling and founded an experimental school at Shantiniketan, which later grew into the Vishwa Bharati University. Tagore was an ardent critic of imperialism and narrow nationalism. He renounced the knighthood bestowed upon him by the British Crown in 1915 to protest against the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in 1919. Now, moving on to a brief summary of The Skeleton. The Skeleton is a ghost story by Rabindranath Tagore that provides a critique of the social constraints placed upon women and the oppression they faced in late 19th century India. It begins with the frame narrative where the male narrator, lying awake in his room, recalls the human skeleton once used there for his anatomy lessons. He is startled by a disembodied voice which claims to be the skeleton's owner and begins to narrate the tragic story of its life. Born as a young and beautiful woman, she was married off quickly, but soon after lost her husband. Her in-laws, accusing her of possessing the evil eye, expel her from their household. Returning to her childhood home, she is socially isolated as a widow and neglected by her family, causing her to create a fantasy world in her mind, where she is the subject of adoration for all men. Among these imagined admirers, she begins to fixate on her brother's doctor friend, Shekhar. Over time, they appear to grow closer, but she is left heartbroken and enraged when he departs to marry another woman. In an act of desperation, she poisons Shekhar and then takes her own life in her bridal robes, seeking in death the love that she was denied in life. At the approach of dawn, the narrator realizes the ghost has fallen silent and vanished. In the end, Tagore's narrative transcends the boundaries of a simple ghost story and presents a haunting reflection on womanhood, love, and social repression. Tagore's short story features several aspects that lend it a Gothic character, which are a Gothic setting. The story is set amidst an eerie and forlorn background. It borrows elements from Victorian Gothic conventions but transplants them to an Indian cultural setting. The past haunting the present. The motive of the intrusion of the past into the present features strongly here through the figure of the ghost who recounts the tragic story of her life. Death. Death is a pervasive and looming presence within the narrative, but also serves as a reminder that it is not the end, and unresolved emotions and unfulfilled desires can persist beyond the grave. Transgression. The story features continuous instances of boundary crossing, with transgressions ranging from emotional and social breaches to those between life and death and even beyond. Domestic Gothic. Both her unhappy marital home and her desolate childhood home serve as spaces of neglect and suffering for the ghost. The domestic sphere, typically associated with warmth and affection, becomes instead a site of repression and emotional torment. Through this portrayal, Tagore infuses the story with a strong domestic Gothic character. There are several indigenous Indian terms and cultural practices referenced in this story, and we will now elaborate on their significance. Evil eye. In India, the evil eye represents a malicious or envious gaze believed to cause harm, misfortune, or sickness to the person or thing at which it is directed to. It symbolizes negative intentions towards individuals, necessitating safeguards against its ominous influence. Attributing misfortune, illness, or a sudden change in luck to the evil eye was a common way to explain unfortunate events in a society without a modern scientific understanding of disease or causality. Champak flower. In 19th century Indian literature, champak blossoms continued to hold traditional symbolic significance, primarily representing sensuality, divine beauty, grace, and eternal love. The delicate waxy petals and golden hue of the flower were frequently used as a poetic metaphor to describe the beauty and grace of women. Golden champak blossoms often represented the balance between earthly desire and spiritual purity. Bela. The jasmine flower, known as Bela in Bengali, was culturally significant across India for its strong fragrance and symbolized femininity, purity, and festivity. Bela flowers were, and still are, widely used for personal adornment, particularly by women who wore them in their hair. The flowers were and are integral to religious rituals and temple offerings due to their association with auspiciousness and purity. Zenana. Zenana comes from the Persian language and means a place for women, as it was believed that women were meant to be limited to the home realm and were not meant to be seen or heard by strangers. This system was largely developed to separate women from men. The educational and employment prospects for women were significantly impacted by the Zenana system. Women were not permitted to work outside the home since it was thought that doing so would undermine their virtue and chastity. It engendered the isolation and marginalization of women by reinforcing patriarchal traditions. Sindoor. In Indian culture, sindoor is a red vermilion powder worn by married Hindu women, symbolizing their marital status and representing a wish for their husband's longevity. It is first applied by the husband during the wedding ceremony and is worn daily by the wife as a visible sign of her marital bond and commitment. The social and cultural background plays a crucial role in the story and therefore warrants a more detailed discussion. Tagore's short story unfolds against the socio-cultural landscape of late 19th century Bengal, a time when India was firmly under British colonial rule. It was a period of cultural negotiation where traditional Indian values were constantly intersecting with Western notions of progress and modernity. Society at the time was marked by an uneasy coexistence. On one side, indigenous customs and age-old practices continued to dominate everyday life. On the other hand, Western education, reformist ideas, and colonial influence were beginning to reshape social attitudes. For women, the reality was particularly harsh. They lived under a deeply entrenched patriarchal system that dictated almost every aspect of their existence. Social evils such as child marriage, polygamy, and the Parda system, where women were secluded from public life, were widespread. These practices reinforced their marginalization and denied them autonomy. Women had few legal rights and were generally under the perpetual control of men, first the father, then the husband, and later the son. They had little to no rights over inherited property, and their earnings, if any, were often controlled by their husband or in-laws. Yet, this was also a period of awakening. Reform movements, led by social and religious reformers, began to challenge regressive practices. Campaigns for women's education gained momentum, and widow remarriage, once considered taboo, was gradually legitimized. These reforms, though limited in reach, signaled the beginnings of a shift in societal attitudes towards women's rights and dignity. This historical and social background plays a crucial role in Tagore's story. By placing the characters in this environment, Tagore highlights both the vulnerability and resilience of women, making his work a sharp commentary on colonial Bengal. Other than the approach that we have used, there are other perspectives that could be explored for further research. The psychoanalytic approach. The skeleton embodies here Freud's concept of the uncanny, the familiar rendered strange and terrifying. The narrator's conversation with the spirit may represent subconscious fears of death and mortality that has been brought to the surface through the supposed figure of the ghost. Tagore's short story offers a rich scope for a psychoanalytic perspective. Bioethics and the politics of the body. The woman is denied agency in life over her own life and body to an extent, but in death, her skeleton is given over for teaching students about the human body. This denial of agency and rights in life and in death is an area that is worth exploring in regards to the voiceless and the marginalized in society then. This brings us to the conclusion. Thank you for your attention.